Okay, so one question some other folks have had too about the class is, do we record all the lectures? Right now, we're just recording these coding demos. I think there's a lot of value, being able to go back and look at them if you need to. The main lectures we're not recording, so if you miss the class, let's say you have COVID or something, or some other obligation, or you just skip class that day. If you want to kind of see what we did in class, so the first thing is we're posting all the lecture slides, for kind of our concept lectures. So you can always review those and drop by either myself or my TA's office hours. We can discuss what you missed. We also have recordings of previous semester's lectures. They're pretty similar. The content changes a little bit every semester, but that's a pretty good stopgap. If you just miss one lecture and you want to watch it, you can do that too. We are trying to record all the coding demos. Okay, so for this, so if you remember on Thursday, we talked a lot about kind of the kind of an introduction to HTML. So we looked at different, header, different elements in HTML headers. There's paragraph elements, there's tables, there's images. A little, just a kind of an appetizer of JavaScript. And so what we're going to kind of finish this lecture off with is a little bit of CSS. So if you look in our code repository, this CSS file, so I've taken out most of the content here, but we'll add content and we'll add some CSS stylings too. Now we've also got a styles.css page here, okay? And a lot of it's commented out too, but we'll uncomment that as we go along. Okay, so CSS stands for cascading style sheets. And so what that does is it lets you stylize or kind of change the appearance of the HTML element page. Okay, so it's basically what you use to make your website look nice. So CSS doesn't require line breaks, but when you see it written either in an HTML file in like a style block, or more generally, it's usually put in its own separate file, a .css file. You'll see it written kind of in this style right here, right, with line breaks, just to make it more readable. Okay. So CSS works on what are called selectors. So there's a couple of different types of selectors. First is you can do a selector on an element. So if I said something like, let's see here. So if we go back to our page. Okay, so let's open it up too so we can see it. Let's open that. Okay, so right now we just have a blank page, right? It just says hello world. Let's add a little bit of content here. So we could say something like h1 first header. We'll add a couple of headers. H1 second header, and one more, H1 third header. So if I save this, the live server will update the page. Right? So you can see that it automatically updates the local web page that we've created. Okay. So in a CSS style file, I can do an element selector and say something like this. So 2, that's going to select all of the H2 elements on the page, right? And so these are H1. So let me actually change this to an H1 type. And if I save this, save that. Well, it's not doing anything because we're going to have to import the page so it actually sees it. So to import an external style file, I could say something like link rel equals style sheet h, the name of the file, styles.css. And so this is a relative file path. So it's in the same folder on my computer, on the server folder. So it's just a local file path. This could be a URL too. I could say like http, slash, wherever the style file is located. And then that style sheet, this indicates that I'm looking for a CSS file, okay? Now, we talked a little bit about on Thursday. Why don't I have to do something like this, where I have a closing tag on the link? So this is what's called it's a self-closing element. Okay, so it's a link. There's not actually content that goes inside the link. So we don't need to close the link. Most HTML elements, right, like title, right, there has to be some sort of content inside the title. So there's a close tag. For a link to another file, we don't actually have to do that. Okay, so we can just do it like this. You sometimes also see it written like this. This is also allowed, where I just put a slash right like that. So either way is fine. Will be interpreted by the browser correctly. Okay. Okay, so let me save this. Let's see if it updates. Yeah. Okay, so I save that. Now, when Chrome parses this HTML document, right, go line by line and start parsing it. When it hits line 5, it's going to say, oh, okay, now I need to, it's like a go-to statement. Go to that file, and now I'm going to be looking for CSS instructions as opposed to HTML content. So to go there, read all of these. So we've got, to read this one. There's this here, and then there's a bunch of commented out things. Okay. And then as it goes down here, when it hits H1, it's going to say, okay, a CSS selector that works on elements of type H1. So any H1 element, style it with, align it in the center, change its color, and change it from like a Times New Roman to like an Arial font, whatever a sans serif is for that for Chrome. Okay, so we can see that. Let's try some other stuff too. So I could say something like ID equals this. So I could say something like class equals header class. Okay. So I could do something like that, right? I give it a class. If you remember, there's IDs and classes. A class can apply to multiple elements. And it could be elements of different types too. I could have like a H1 and H2. They could both be the same class. IDs can only apply to one element. So if I do, so for that, I could say something like second header. So in my style file, if I wanted to apply styling just to elements of the header class type, okay, I'll copy that. So in the file, I need to do a dot header class. So the dot says this, I'm looking for a class selection. Okay, so I'm going to select all of the elements that have that class. Open a bracket, and I could say, I don't know, color Firebrick. That's a cool name. Okay. No, that's too close to red. So let's not do Firebrick. Let's just do something easy. Aqua. Okay. All right. So if I save this, now you see that one header is red. The first header is red. The second and third ones are this aqua color. Okay, so there's two selectors that are happening here. One is, right, so as the Chrome is parsing this, it's going to say, okay, so we have a H1. So all of the H1 elements make them this red color. But it's also going to say, oh, look, now we have a aqua color. So this is a more specific selection than the H1. So it's basically going to overrule or override it. And we can actually see that in Chrome. So if we open up the dev tools, I'll right click and say inspect. So this will open up the dev tools. I can click this little icon here to do the element selector. If I go to second header here, I can see here, you can see the class and it's got an ID. I can actually see here that, Yeah, there you go. Right, so I can see that both of my styles.css, it's trying to apply those styles to this element, okay? But this one gets overwritten, right? It's crossed out. So this is a great tool for debugging, right? If you're like trying to, if you're working on a homework or your project and something's like not rendering like it, DevTools is a really, really great resource, right? I can see is something else overriding my CSS. Okay. We can also do selections on IDs. So this second header could say #, not a hashtag. You give it a different color. Just say green. I save that, right? That's even more specific than a class selection. So it's going to select the second header. Okay. Now, the most specific thing I could do is I could actually, I can do an inline style. So I could open up a style property on the element and say something like color equals like black. And if I save that, so that'll overwrite basically everything else. So it's, the more specific or kind of the lower level selection that you do is going to overwrite. Okay, so let's do a little bit more stuff here. Let me just copy paste all the content from the from our GitHub repository here. So let's fill out the rest of the page. Okay, so I've added a bunch more content. We have some divs here. Okay, so we'll talk about those in a sec. We have some paragraphs down below. Okay, you can see the paragraphs have different IDs on them. And so let's go look at changing these. So one thing we could do, right? So one of the things I have here is this P for paragraph. So if I save that, that will change all of the paragraph text to this dark cyan color, right? So it's another example of an element selection. Even though there's lots of paragraph elements on this page, it'll select all of them. Okay. Yes. That's an English word. Dark cyan? No. Oh, the lorem ipsum. Oh, so who knows about lorem ipsum stuff? Okay, so I'm right in the projector light. So let me ask it. So you know about it? Okay, so I don't actually, I know it's a thing. Do you know why?
It's just like, okay, when I learned it's placeholder for the graphic.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds right. We'll go with that. So basically, it's kind of like gibberish text. It kind of, maybe it's Latin. I don't know.
It's not even real Latin.
Okay, so it's fake Latin.
Fake Latin.
But yeah, it's used. You see it a lot in like, if you go look at like themes for a website, it's kind of here's what content can look like. It's just a lot easier than like me writing something real. I guess I could do my diary and put it up there. My old MySpace. Okay, so here's an example of, so let me actually comment this out real quick. You can look at the raw divs. So let me comment that out, save this. Here's a couple of divs. We have 3 divs. They each have a class called content div, and I have a little kind of introduction to divs. So a div stands for division. And divs are very common in web design. So by default, browsers will stack divs on top of each other. And there's kind of this, so a lot of times we don't like that. Okay, so what we'll do, add some CSS, right? So these are stacked on top of each other. So if I zoom over, right, you can see that there's enough space here they could sit side by side. Right, so we've got a bunch of other just random CSS, right? We can do things like change the background color. We give them a set width, a set height. margin and padding are they're pretty important CSS styles, I think. They're very common. The margin is the outside space around an element. And the padding is the inside space. So if I, example of that, so if I margin, right, you can see they touch now and they go all the way to the left. If I comment it back, right, now there's a 30 pixel gap or kind of outside space that's the margin. Padding is the inside, so if I comment that out, you'll see that the inside text goes all the way up to the edge. So those are very common. Border, so I can define a border radius, that's what gives it this curved edge, and then some font things. So all that to say, CSS command here, float left, that's commented out. And so if I comment that out, okay, now you can see that they kind of get pushed, well, this way, they get pushed to the left side of the screen, right? And they don't stack anymore. And the content that comes after that kind of fills in the gap. That's not quite what we want. We'll talk more about layout in Thursday's lecture, but for me personally, this is the most frustrating part of sort of web stuff is like figuring out how to get everything to kind of position where I want it. So yeah, especially as you get more into like, we mentioned responsive web design, designing for mobile, designing for different size browsers. You can really go in the weeds doing all this. Yeah, I don't like that float left. We'll take it out for now. Okay, and so then here we have a couple of, so this is just another example of the ID and class attributes. So in the CSS file, if we comment these out, let me take out these here. So before I reload this page, right, you can see that the default, we've got a selector on the key element, which is going to turn it this kind of greenish color. So if I save this and reload it, all right, now there's a lot going on. So the first thing to notice, right, I have each of these paragraphs have ID tags, and we have styles that kind of select on each of those. So the top paragraph, I change the font size, I change the color. The middle paragraph, I make the font size really low. And then the bottom one, I make it kind of middle sized. Okay. I've also got a class called highlighted here. So let's find that and see what it does. So highlighted, I put in a span. So spans are usually for like a selection of text, a span of text, normally like inside a paragraph or maybe inside of like a list or something. So span class highlighted. Right, so in the style file, if we go back to that, you can see that inside that span, we bold the font weight, we change the background color, and we change the text color. So you can see that right here. And then I've got some other ones down here. Okay. Now there's two other CSS selectors here. So one, you can see it says bottom : hover. And then P : selection. Okay. So this : hover, this is called a pseudo class. So it means whenever I'm doing a hover mouse event on an element with the ID bottom. So if I hover over an element with the ID bottom, apply that CSS. So for that, we'll change the background color like that. So you see this a lot like on a hyperlink. If you hover on a hyperlink, it kind of emphasizes it somehow, like maybe the background highlights or it turns bold or something. That's this type of behavior usually. And so this here, P selection, colon means pseudo element. Okay, so if I click and drag to kind of select a set of text, so that selection is called a pseudo element. And I'm going to apply a yellow, change the text color to yellow, and change the background color to maroon. Okay. So, as I say here, there are lots of available pseudo classes and pseudo elements. There are a lot of CSS styles out there. This class is like very much barely scratching the surface. Let's say you're working on your page, right, and you say, okay, I want to get this type of styling or this type of behavior. The best way to figure that out is to Google it. Right? Look at the documentation, look at, did someone ask it on Stack Overflow? That is pretty how I do a lot of my web coding. Right? There's a lot of, there's a lot of websites out there with very nice stylings. There's too many things to remember. So the easiest thing to do is just learn how to read the documentation, right? How do I implement this thing? What's the available properties for a style? What's the syntax, right? I know how to go look it up and find the answer. Okay. Okay, so any questions on this? We'll talk more about layouts and CSS on our next lecture too. Okay, well, in that case, let's stop this recording. We'll get into today's actual lecture.